Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States in August 1923 and remained in office until 1929. This period became known as the Roaring Twenties. The motor car was a new feature of daily life for many people. Millions of people had their own radio for the first time. The Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, was pioneering new laws in regard to aviation and radio broadcasting. It was a time of great optimism and progress. The United States had suddenly become the richest and most powerful nation in the world with a population of over 110 million people. However, there was also a downside. Scandals had rocked the previous administration of Warren Harding, and Coolidge was left to pick up the mess. He became president when Harding died suddenly in August 23. Here we take a brief look at the background of the new president. Calvin Coolidge was born in Vermont on the 4th of July, 1872. He attended Black River Academy and Amherst College. He later studied law as an apprentice with a legal company in Massachusetts, so that by the age of 25 he was called to the bar, and the following year he set up his own legal firm. In 1905 he married Grace Goodhue. They had two sons, John and Galvin. Unfortunately, Calvin died at the age of 16 in 1924, an event from which Coolidge never really recovered. As a young man, Coolidge became involved in Republican politics and became mayor of Northampton in Massachusetts in 1910. 2 years later, in 1912, he won a seat in the Massachusetts Senate. The following year, 1913, Coolidge, as a state senator, helped to settle a major strike in the American Woolen Company in Massachusetts, for which he got a lot of favourable publicity. He was also involved in pushing through the Western Trolley Act, which was a major benefit to many towns in the state. By 1918, he had become governor of Massachusetts, and the following year he developed a national reputation by his decisive action in the settlement of the Boston police strike. Coolidge was one of the least known presidents when he assumed office in August 23. He had been vice president to President Warren Harding, who had just died of a heart attack. Most people knew nothing about him except that he broke up a police strike a couple of years earlier. However, at the Republican convention in 1920, he became the delegates' favourite, mainly due to his national profile as a result of his handling of the police strike. Harding invited him to attend cabinet meetings. In fact, he was the first vice president ever to do so, and his reputation as Silent Cal served him well on such occasions. He was on vacation in his family home in Vermont when he received news of Harding's death. His father, John Coolidge, who was a Justice of the Peace locally, administered the oath of office on the 3rd of August 1923. It was early in the morning, about 2:45 a.m, and afterwards Coolidge went back to bed. As president, however, he was immediately confronted by a number of major and serious scandals. The Teapot Dome scandal was being investigated by a Senate committee. Contractors building hospitals for Army veterans were also involved in bribery and corruption. When the Attorney General, Harry Doherty, refused to cooperate with the Senate committee, Coolidge sacked him. Coolidge allowed the various Senate committees and court cases to proceed and exposed these scandals. Eventually, one previous cabinet secretary, Albert Fall, was imprisoned for bribery for leasing oil fields to oil companies at below market value. Gradually recovered respect for the presidency, however, and won the November 24 election as a result with 54% of the popular vote. In 1924, Coolidge signed the Immigration Act, which restricted immigrants from both southern and eastern Europe. He also signed the Revenue Act of 24, which reduced tax rates and also minimised government spending. The Treasury Secretary, Anthony Mellon, and the President himself believed that lower rates could boost the economy, and this led to what became known as the Roaring Twenties. In June 1924, the President signed an act granting citizenship to all Native Americans. In fact, Coolidge himself was of Indian descent, but by 1924 anyway, most Indians were already citizens through either marriage or property rights. The Republican convention was held in June 24 in Cleveland, Ohio. Coolidge was selected along with Charles Dawes as his running mate. The both went on to win the November election with 54% of the popular vote, and Dawes later became a Nobel Prize winner for his plan to revive the German economy. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, pioneered major legislation in regard to aviation and radio broadcasting. The President believed in minimum labour laws and that such laws were best left in the hands of the individual states. In the United States in the 1920s, farming was going through a tough period, and congressmen from both western and southern states sought government support for farmers in the form of guaranteed prices for products. Coolidge vetoed such proposals, believing that taxes from the more productive sectors of the economy should not be used to support the weaker sectors. He also opposed government aid to victims of the Mississippi flood of 1927. However, he changed his mind somewhat by 1928 when he reluctantly signed a compromise bill given the horrendous damage done to both businesses and farms in the region. Coolidge and Hoover were both strong conservatives who believed business and farms should carry their own losses. In regard to civil rights, he supported people of colour. Both on radio and in Congress, he pleaded to make lynchings a federal crime, but most people in Congress believed that this was an issue for the individual states. He was the first president to use radio on a frequent basis and made dozens of radio broadcasts during his 6-year term as president. He pleaded for fair and equal treatment for people of colour. In relation to foreign affairs, Latin America continued to be a troubled region, partly because of American interference and partly because of internal instabilities within these countries. Efforts were made, for example, to normalise relations with Mexico. The US recognised and supported the government of Plutarco Calles. He introduced a liberal government based on the 1917 Mexican Constitution. However, there was fierce Catholic resistance which led to the Cristero Wars in the late 1920s, where over 100,000 people were killed. The US had huge business interests and huge oil interests in Mexico and continues to support the Calles regime. In 1924, the US withdrew its forces from the Dominican Republic in line with a previous agreement under the Harding administration. However, it continued to occupy both Haiti and Nicaragua. There were concerns that some European power would construct a rival canal through Nicaragua, and therefore US occupation of that country continued. Throughout the 1920s, the US continued to have a strong presence in several Latin American countries. The United Fruit Company, for example, owned several million acres in Honduras and controlled most of that country's revenue. US firms dominated Venezuelan oil companies, and the US maintained a military presence in Panama in order to protect the Panama Canal. However, by the late 1920s, there was growing resistance to American dominance. In 1928, the 6th Pan-American Conference was held in Havana, Cuba. The US sent a strong delegation, which included President Coolidge, the Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, and the ex-Secretary Charles Evans Hughes as a special envoy. Hughes made a powerful speech reminding delegates of their common interests in regard to defence policy and trade policy. The US made commitments to vacating various republics as soon as stability was restored. The combined efforts of the US delegation avoided the conference passing a strong anti-American resolution, and the United States kept most of its promises during the Roosevelt presidency of the 1930s. In regard to Europe, Coolidge continued to withhold recognition of the Soviet Union. That country had become totally communist by the mid-20s, and Stalin had murdered millions of farmers and small business people and was therefore totally opposed by the United States. The US also refused to join the League of Nations, but sent observers to keep track of events in Europe. In 1924, Coolidge approved the Dawes Plan, which was put together by American banker Charles Dawes. Dawes had been the first director of the Bureau of the Budget under Warren Harding in the 1921-22 period. His plan helped to revive both the German and the European economies, and this also indirectly helped the US economy through increased exports to Europe. Dawes later became Coolidge's running mate in November 24, and later, a few years later, went on to win partly the Nobel Prize. In 1925, Frank Kellogg replaced Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, and he negotiated the Kellogg-Briand Pact with his French counterpart in 1928. Here, 14 countries, including the UK, France, Germany, Italy and Japan, agreed to settle their disputes without resorting to war. However, the pact lacked enforcement powers and fell apart a few years later under the pressure from an aggressive Germany. In relation to Canada, Coolidge authorised the St. Lawrence Seaway. This was basically a system of locks and canals that would provide a passageway for large boats and vessels between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes, and it helped to boost the economic activity in the area. It was important both to North America and to Canada. Coolidge initially retained all of the cabinet of Warren Harding. He felt a sense of loyalty to the previous president. Andrew Mellon was Secretary of the Treasury, and he was very successful and very influential throughout the 20s. The Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, had developed poor health by the mid-20s and was replaced by Frank Kellogg in 25. Herbert Hoover, the very energetic Commerce Secretary, went on to become the next president. Charles Dawes became the vice president during Coolidge's second term. Calvin Coolidge was a very successful president, could easily have won the 28 election, but the death of his son Calvin 4 years earlier caused him frequent depression. In the summer of 27, Coolidge was on vacation in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and he issued a brief statement. "I do not choose to run for president in 1928, he said. He felt 10 years was too long to be president. Herbert Hoover won in a landslide for the Republicans. Coolidge wrote his memoirs in the next few years, and he died 4 years later in 1933 at the age of 60.